This morning we are going to jump back into Genesis, and this is where we're going to spend the next 11 weeks. And so I'd encourage you to be reading through. We're going to start in Genesis 20 this morning, and in the 11 weeks we're making it through Genesis 25. So we're not going to get super far, but we are going to spend our time here. So I'd encourage you to read it. We're jumping back into what's called the Abraham narrative, and really it's just it's the story about Abraham. And God had made some great promises to Abraham. If you read in Genesis 12, if you're not familiar with the Abraham story, start reading in Genesis 12. That's where you're introduced to Abraham. And really what you find is that God made a covenant with Abraham. God made a promise to Abraham. God said to Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. It's interesting, in Genesis chapter 11, the people of Babel, the Tower of Babel, they say, we're going to make our name great, and God frustrates those ways. In Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. And in making your name great, I'm going to make you into a multitude of nations. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you a land that I'm going to show you. I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I'm going to curse those who curse you. And that's really the story, as the story unfolds, is this promise that God makes to Abraham. Now, Abraham, he's promised these many nations, these many descendants, more than you could count, more stars than in the sky, more sand that's on the seashore. There's so many descendants, but Abraham doesn't have one at all. Now, we're going to see this fall that he's going to get one, but God has made these promises of, like, there's going to be these wonderful descendants, and you've got none. There's going to be this land, but except for you're a nomad. And so there's this great disparity between the promises that God makes and what Abraham is experiencing. People want to know what faith is. They go, well, faith is the difference between the promises God has given you and what you're experiencing. And the greater the disparity between the promises God has given you and what you're experiencing, the greater the faith is required. Because you're saying, but God, you promised, but God, you said. And I'm going to make decisions as if what you said, what you promise, is going to come to fruition. And this is Abraham's story. Many descendants. And truth is, today, all of the monotheistic religions, mostly, I guess, most of the vast majority of the monotheistic religions, so religions that believe in one God, are tied to Abraham. In fact, the three big ones, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all believe that Abraham is Father Abraham. That from Abraham we have descended, spiritually, some physically. And so it's interesting that all of these, even different religions, is that we have this one common theme of all monotheistic religion, is really this idea that Abraham at some level is the father, part of the father of the faith, or one of the patriarchs of the faith. And what we found out last fall, because I know you remember it verbatim, is that God is the promise keeper. So he's the promise maker and the promise keeper. And we think often that what it is, that God makes his promises, then it's our job to keep those promises. Well, no, our job is to live faithfully. So God is the promise maker. He makes the promises. He's the one that keeps the promises. Our job is to live faithfully in the shadow of those two truths, that God makes the promises and keeps the promises. And when we come across the heroes of the Bible, now Abraham is certainly one of the heroes of the Bible, what you're going to see is you're going to see great moments of faithfulness, and you're going to see great moments of unfaithfulness. It's actually one of the things I love about the Bible, how it's true and honest about its heroes. In fact, actually, there's only one really biblical character that is always faithful, never unfaithful, and that's just Jesus. But everybody else, for the most part, is just, they've got these stories of faithfulness. You think, oh my gosh, I could never do that. And then there's followed by these stories of unfaithfulness where you think to yourself, I would never do that. Oh my gosh, how could he do that? I would never do that. And we were going to ping pong back and forth between these two. And truth be told, you probably have similar experiences. Experiences where you go, I feel like I did that well. I was faithful to what God asked me to do. And then like the next day or the next hour, you go, oh my gosh, I'm a total train wreck, unfaithful to God and to his promises. And we see this. And what happens sometimes is that people, because they're biblical heroes, they feel the need to polish up the unfaithful places of their life. And they go, oh, well, it's really, it seems as if it's unfaithful, but really it's not unfaithful. He's actually really being faithful here. You go, no, we can be honest in the same way that the Bible is honest. In counseling, there's this thing called the good-bad split. And with the good-bad split is that if somebody's good, then everything they do is good, and everything they do is right and awesome. And if we perceive that person's bad, then everything they do is bad, everything is tainted, and what they do, everything they say is mean. And in counseling, we would talk about this good-bad split. It's not a healthy thing, right? It's like, oh, that person's good, everything they do is good. And so then I have to justify their bad behavior because they're really good people. And this person over here who's not a good person, even though they might do something that would be a good thing, I have to justify it. So it's really a bad thing. So an example of this is if you perceive somebody to be bad, like, oh, they're not nice, they are not a good human being, and they come into the office and they're like, hey, good morning. You go, oh, you would say that, wouldn't you? Good morning. Like, who do you think you are to say good morning to me? So arrogant. And somebody you perceive as good starts doing behavior in which is, you go, that's not good behavior. You feel like you have to justify it. Well, you know. And by the way, this is happening with us like in politics right now, in the world. If it's my person, they're good, everything they do is good, and I have to justify their bad behavior. Or if the other side, they're bad, and everything they do is bad, even if they have a good policy, no, that's the reason why that's not a good policy, whatever it be. And we're buying into this. The beautiful thing is that we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that with our biblical heroes. We don't need to even do that with, even less so with politicians. Because I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and the speaker had said something, and I go, I love that. And he used the phrase, critically appreciative. He says, we can be critically appreciative. And I go, I like that. Because I think all we're doing is either being just super critical or just appreciative. But there's actually ways we can, like for instance, with Abraham, we can appreciate him. Like we owe so much to Abraham. There are moments of faith that he has that we would only ever dream of. And so we can be appreciative for all that he's done. But that doesn't mean we have to appreciate all that he did. We can still be critical. We can still say, yeah, so I'm appreciative of this. We're going to be critical of this. And I love that term. And actually that term, that critical appreciative, I want to be critically appreciative. I'm applying to many areas of my life. We can be both critical and appreciative. And so we're going to do that this morning. This morning what we're going to get, though, we're going to get a story that is, we're going to be probably more critical than appreciative of Abraham. And it's going to be a story, we're actually spending the same story 2 weeks, because what happens now Abraham is the protagonist of, he's the good guy. What happens when the good guy becomes the bad guy? What happens when the protagonist acts more like the antagonist? What happens when the one that is to be faithful proves to be unfaithful? What do we do in those places? And what we're going to do is we're going to spend 2 weeks in the same story. It's going to be Genesis chapter 20. And we're going to look at it this week through the lens of Abraham and Abimelech. And you go, who's that? Don't worry, we're going to get there. Slow down, calm down. We're going to get there. We're going to look through Abraham and Abimelech. And then next week, we're going to look through the same story through the lens of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is Abraham's wife. So, if you got your Bibles, turn with me to Genesis chapter 20. We're going to start in verse 1 and then go through the following this morning. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now this is going to sound like a very familiar story. That Abraham, actually after leaving, so if you look at 19, it's the Sodom and Gomorrah story. It's the narrative. So after kind of leaving that and then the following story, he shows back up once again in a foreign land with foreign people. And he comes across the king, or is it here Abimelech? Abimelech just really means Melech is king, Avi is father. So either father is my king or my king is father or whatever. But comes across Abimelech, and as he comes in, he goes to Sarah. Now Sarah, who's his wife, say to whoever asks you that you are my sister. Because we're going to find out he's going to be afraid of what they will do to Sarah and to him if they find out that Sarah is his wife instead of his sister. And so if you think about the story, you think, but didn't we already cover a story like this? I mean, if you read Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham shows up in a foreign land with his wife Sarah and says to Pharaoh, yeah, this is my sister, and then Pharaoh takes Sarah as his wife. You go, doesn't that sound familiar? In fact, actually, some people think this story is a duplicate. In fact, some scholars would say, yeah, this story is a duplicate of Genesis chapter 12, where we see similar things. They go, no, I don't think it's a duplicate. And most don't believe that it's a duplicate. Most believe that it's not duplicate as much as it is cyclical, right? And you know this is to be true, is that the same sort of sin patterns find you over and over again. And it's interesting because your sin pattern is different than somebody else's sin pattern. But your sin pattern, you know what it's like, is there's a cycle to it. There's a cycle. In fact, you actually may even tell somebody the story, like, okay, so here's the story, and they would say, oh yeah, you already told me this. You go, no, actually, no, I told you something very similar to this. This is the new version. This is my sin cycle 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. It's the updated, latest version, and it's worse than all the other ones. And so I think that's what this is. Sort of, kind of same story, different story. Same story, different time. Same story, different players. Same story, different location. It's kind of what we do. And so what we see here is we see Abraham showing up in a foreign land. He's afraid of what they're going to do to his wife, Sarah, who's now 90, and what they're going to do to him. And so he says, just tell Abimelech that you're my sister. And then, so when he comes up, yeah, I'm his sister. That's fantastic. So you can then now be my wife. And that's what it says, that Abimelech took, basically, Sarah to be his wife. It goes on then in 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, and you and all who are yours. And so Abraham lies to Abimelech, she is my sister. Sarah lies to Abimelech, yeah, he's my brother. And really, as we're going to find out, that's technically true, but not really true. And he goes, isn't that what they said? And so then God shows up to Abimelech, and the idea here is that he took her to be her wife, but they have not yet consummated, we're all adults here, they have not had sex yet, they have not consummated the marriage. God comes to Abimelech in a dream and says, you're a dead man. Now some of you guys may want to dream dreams. You may even want God to speak to you clearly. Have you ever prayed, like, God, just speak to me clearly. God, come to me in a dream, speak to me clearly. You wouldn't want this message clearly. I'll speak to you clearly. You're a dead man. You're a dead man, for you have taken somebody else's wife. I love this. Abimelech, as far as we know, is not a follower of Yahweh. And God comes to him in a dream. God has ways of communicating truth. Abraham, Sarah communicating half-truths, and by half-truth I mean full lies. Full lies. And God has a way of communicating truth. God has a way of getting his message across. Actually, sometimes when people aren't, I feel like, God, I just feel like you're not, no, nothing's getting through to them right now. You know what my prayers is? Something like this. God, would you come to them in a dream? When their mind is at ease, when their mind is in neutral, when they actually here's the crazy thing. You can't control what you dream, and you know that because you dream crazy stuff. You're like, who dreams that? Like, you did. How do you can't. And there's times that God can come to you, I believe, in a dream and speak to you. It's not I don't think it's his main way of communication. I think this is his main way of communication. And by the way, what God says in a dream will not contradict what he says here. This would be a good example. He's saying you're about to commit adultery, and here it says adultery is a bad thing, and don't do that. And so he says you're going to take this man. You've taken a man's wife, and you're a dead man. And I love his response. Abimelech says, like, well, first of all, no, we haven't consummated the marriage, and like, I only did this because I didn't know. I'm an innocent man. My hands are clean. And I love what God's response really is to Abimelech. Yeah, well, your hands are clean, but that's just because I kept them clean. Like, because really Abimelech is like, oh, whoa. Well, I did not know. It would be a sin of ignorance. But notice, even with the sin of ignorance, because I didn't know, that God still actually holds the sins of ignorance accountable. We think that if we didn't know, then we're not responsible. God seems to think that even if you didn't know, you're still responsible. And then when you know, you're even more responsible. I've had lots of conversations with people that go, yeah, I didn't know. And then I go, okay, all right, fair enough. You did not know. Now you know. Right now you know. And so you can no longer claim ignorance. And actually right now with this story, Abimelech can no longer claim ignorance. And the question will be, how will he act now on the new information? And so what we see here, he says, I didn't know. God says, well, yes, I know you didn't know, but I was the one who kept you from sinning. So that wasn't your innocence. It wasn't the integrity of your heart. I kept you from sinning. And notice, I kept you from sinning, from committing the act of adultery. And two things I want to note about adultery. We're going to come back more to this next week as well with Sarah. But two things I want you to note about adultery is that, I would say, it's like adultery has long been like an offense, a sin. When you think about this, you think about all that is in our culture today that is so morally different than thousands of years ago, thousands of miles ago. But I think something about adultery, and by the way, we say fornication is sex act between two people who are not married. That's fornication. Adultery is a sex act between two people, at least two people, one of whom is married. Now, both of them could be married, but one of them, so there's a marriage covenant. And so anyways, so with this, is notice how long adultery has been seen as an offense. And not just by like years, but like miles too. And I think, to me, I go, that's an interesting thing. There's not much morally that we would agree on, but we would agree on if there has been a covenant of marriage made, that the act of sex outside of that covenant is somehow is morally morally wrong, morally wicked, and that's because a promise has been made. And interestingly, even now, like we would say, the idea of fornication, sex act between two people not married, and adultery is different. And we go, yeah, why? Because there's been a promise made, a covenant made. So I want you to see the long-term standing of the sin of adultery. The other thing I want you to see here is that God says, I kept you from sinning against who? Against me. That's what he says. That's in verse 6. God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against who? Against me. Now, this is interesting because he has said, I've kept you from the act of adultery. I've kept you from sinning against me. Now, we would think that he would say is that I kept you from the act of adultery. I kept you from sinning against Abraham because this is his wife. I kept you from sinning against Sarah because she's a married woman. That's not what the text says. The text says, I kept you from sinning against me. Interestingly enough, this is not the only place that we see this. When King David, he sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, taking a bath, and And he said, I had to have her commit adultery with Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. Bathsheba gets pregnant with that act of adultery. Then what King David does is King David puts Uriah on the front lines, and Uriah is killed in battle. And then David takes Bathsheba to be his wife. Some time goes by. The prophet Nathan comes to David, tells him a story, and basically says, what you did with Bathsheba was a great sin. In David's confession, it's a Psalm 51. David is confessing the sin, repenting of the sin. Do you know what he says there? He says, God, against you and you alone have I sinned. Now that should be shocking, because you'd think like Uriah would be like, wait, hold on. Okay, yeah, so I feel like I'm in the mix there somewhere, right? But David says, against you and you alone have I sinned. It seems like Bathsheba would be like, whoa, hold the phone. I'm in that mix somewhere too. But actually in those places is that actually that adultery is first and foremost a sin against God. Now how do we get there? And if you've ever been in a relationship where you've been on the, like someone was unfaithful to you in an adulterous way, you would think to yourself, yeah, I felt like I was sinned against. And the truth is that you were. But first and foremost is that adultery is a sin against God. Now, how do we get there? Well, this last about a little over a week ago, I just did my nephew's wedding, and I tell them as we do the rehearsal, I say, as you stand before me, right? So there's three parties in this covenant. There's Zachary, the groom. There's Nellie, the bride, and then I come as the representative of God. And so really the covenant is being made between basically Zach, you and God, Nellie and God, and then you guys to each other. That's how this goes. And so by the way, if you ever go to a wedding, there's a reason why they stand facing the pastor first, and then they turn to each other, because that's the way the ceremony goes. We're talking about the covenant that you're making. Now you guys make the covenant to each other. And so this is not just a covenant between you guys. This is a covenant between you and God and you guys. And so in the marriage covenant, he says, so why is this a sin? Why does God say you're sinning against me? Because I would say, first and foremost, it's a sin against the greatest member of that covenant, which is God himself. Now we think, oh, well, that's a sin against my wife. That's a sin against my husband. 100% true. Yes. But more than that is that actually God is the most important person in that covenant. And God seems to think that because in these places he said, you're sinning against Abraham? No. You're sinning against, well, yes, but you're sinning mostly against Abraham? No. Mostly against Sarah? No. I've kept you from sinning against me. And so God comes to Abimelech, and the dream says, you're a dead man. You better get her back to her husband. Now this goes from a sin of ignorance, right? Because now you know, Abimelech, what do you do? Well, then it says in verse 8, so Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. And so it's interesting because they call them all in. So Abimelech said, all right, we got to do something. So he gets all of his people in here. He says, so let me tell you about the dream last night. I'm a dead man because she's married. Like, oh my gosh, she's married? Like, yeah. So that's not what they said. I know that's not what they said. They said sister. I could remember correctly. Sister and brother. That's what I heard. And so it's interesting is that Abimelech is afraid. The people are afraid. The only person who should be afraid, who's not afraid, seems to be Abraham. Which is then what we find is that Abimelech then calls Abraham in. Verse 9. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? And Abraham said, I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place. and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, although not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me, that every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. And so Abraham says, yeah, by the way, you're not the only one, Abimelech. We've been doing this all up and down the coast, man. This is a thing that we run. This is our mode. This is what we do. And so Abimelech calls in Abraham and says, what is the deal? Like, what did I do to you that you would do this to me? I thought about this week in preparing for this message that there's often two signs that you're trapped deep within sin. And the two signs that show that you are trapped deep within sin is, one, when you personalize the effects of your sin, and then two, when you justify the actions of your sin. So the first is when you personalize the effects of your sin. The second is when you justify the actions of your sin. And this is what we see here. This idea of personalization. This idea is like, often when people sin, they think like, oh, I first and foremost, I am affected by my own sin. And it's only affecting me. And actually, that's the world that we live in right now. As long as it only affects me, I can do whatever I want to do. It's because first and foremost, my sin is affecting me the most. I go, no. Which is crazy. This is how you know. You're even thinking selfishly about your sin. Because you go, well, it's only affecting me, Josh. I go, no, that's false. And if you believe that lie, then you're deeper in than you know. You're more self-centered than you know, because you are failing to see how your sin, whether intended or unintended, whether known or unknown, is causing consequences for other people. And this is what we see. Here, like Abraham's just thinking, I'll save myself. It's not going to do anything to Abimelech. And Abimelech says, what did I do to you? Do you know what you've caused me? Do you know what your sin has done to me? Do you know what your unfaithfulness has done to me and to my people? It's interesting because sometimes when you sin, you can directly see the effects. We'll say something like you get angry, and in your anger you blow up and you say things that you should not have said. And you think to yourself, oh man, I really harmed some relationships. I got to go back and be like, I'm sorry I blew up. I'm sorry that my anger got out of control. So there may be a lot of times, maybe you do see the effects of your sin that directly impact others, but I'd say most of the time you don't see that. In fact, actually what we believe culturally, and I think this leads into our Christian faith, is that my sin's it's not that big of a deal as long as it only affects me. And so I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make sure that my sin only affects me. And I go, that's only true if you live in a vacuum. And not like a proverbial vacuum, not a real vacuum, because that would be weird. But if you live in a vacuum, like nothing else is coming into the environment. I don't know why I thought that. But nothing else is coming into the environment. It's the only way that works. Because to give you an example of this, someone says, well, so if somebody is greedy, a lover of money, they go, well, that's not an issue as long as all of my business dealings are done with absolute integrity. So I never cheat anybody. Everybody gets what's a fair deal. Everybody gets what's theirs. Everybody wins. So if I'm not cheating anybody, if I do all my business dealings are above reproach, they have complete integrity, the fact that I love money doesn't matter. You go, oh, but it does. But then my greed, it doesn't affect any of my business. I'm not cheating people out of money, so that it's okay. I go, no. Because that love of money is replacing other loves. And actually, it's replacing other loves that you don't even see. You don't even know. Your sin always, always, always has an effect on the people around you. Sin is never isolated. And so it's interesting what Abraham thinks, like, that was just my thing. I just did that to save myself. Abimelech's like, no, your unfaithfulness has caused like great turmoil in my kingdom. And by the way, God came to me in the dream and says, you're a dead man. So yeah, I'm going to submit that your sin, your unfaithfulness, has had an effect on my life because I made some decisions based on the things you told me. The other thing that we do when we're trapped in sin is not only do we personalize the effects of the sin, but we also justify the actions. Do you see what Abraham does? It's interesting. When Abimelech confronted with his sin, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid. What do I need to do? Abraham, when confronted with his sin, what does he do? Yeah, he blame shifts. Whoa. Hey, what did you do to my kingdom? Why would you do this to me? What did I ever do to you, Abraham? Okay, all right. You want to know what you did to me? Well, okay, so I just thought that there's no fear of God in this place. And so I figured that was true. And so because that was true, because there's no fear of God in this place, which is really interesting because there is fear of God in this place, right? Abimelech, all of the people are afraid. Because there is fear of God in this place. But I assume that there wasn't, made decisions based on that assumption. And that's why, so basically you brought this on yourself. If you guys were known as God-fearing people, I would not have had to do this. But because everybody knows that you're not God-fearing people, I had to act this way. So really, this is your fault that all of this happened. I love that. It's like, I just assumed the worst of you. I made decisions based on that assumption. So I don't see how this is my fault. So then he does that. And then he goes to the next, right? Which is the idea that, and by the way, I kind of told you the truth. Like I didn't really lie. So this is your fault because everybody knows you're not God-fearing people. And still this is not my fault because I did tell you technically the truth. It's not my fault you didn't ask more questions like, are you married? See, if you would have asked me that question straight out, I'm like, well, yeah, got us busted, we are. And so I didn't actually lie. And then I love what he does. So he didn't really lie. This is really your fault for being known for people who don't fear God. And then he says, verse 13, and when God, what? When God caused me to wander from my father's house. This is also God's fault. Like, this is not my fault. God is the one who caused me to wander. God is the one who's led me around. This is not on me. And if God had just left me alone in my house, like I would not be going to foreign lands having to say that my wife is my sister. You think I want to do that? I don't want to do that. But because God has caused me to do that. All Abraham does is just blame shift. Not my fault. Not my fault. You want to know how and when you are trapped in sin? You personalize the effects of the sin. It's just me. It's just me. It's only me. It doesn't affect other people. Just me. Do whatever I want as long as it just affects me. And then you justify the actions of your sin. Under normal circumstances, this is not a good thing. But my circumstances, God's caused me to wander. You guys are people that are not known for fearing the Lord. Plus, I kind of did tell the truth. It's not my fault. You didn't ask more questions. And so it's interesting that with Abimelech, he responds well with the potential of sin. He pleads ignorance, but then fear, and then obedience. And with Abraham, who's confronted with sin, all he does is blame shift. Then in verse 14, then Abimelech took the sheep and the oxen and the male servants and the female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. And to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. I love that, by the way. But I give your who? Your brother. Yeah, your brother. It's not your brother, but I gave your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in all the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all of the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. It's interesting, and we'll get more into this next week. But notice in this passage how it's Abimelech is your wife, your wife, your wife. God is like your wife, your wife, your wife. It's Abraham is like, well, my sister, really, my sister, my sister, my sister. And so actually what Abimelech does in response is he says, here, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you. Remember the promise, I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you oxen. I'm going to restore your wife to you. And I'm going to give you land. And I'm going to give to your brother 1,000 pieces as a way of really declaring to everybody that you are innocent, Sarah. And so we'll get more into that this week. But it's interesting how what we see here is then Abimelech, he responds really faithfully. And then Abraham prays for Abimelech. And God actually hears that prayer. We go, how long was this going on for? We go, well, we don't know, but it's long enough for them to notice that the wombs of everybody around had been closed. So I don't know how long that takes. What's the timeline of like everybody noticing like, hey, wait a minute. There haven't been babies being conceived or here recently. What's going on? So at least that long. And it says then Abraham prays for Abimelech, and then the wombs of all of those around are opened up. And here's a frustrating thing if you're Abraham, is that what's going on with his wife? She cannot bear children. And then he prays for Abimelech, and then all of his household just starts conceiving babies. And I go, if you're Abraham, that's frustrating. And it's frustrating because there's these places where maybe there's something that you want, and then you come across somebody else who wants the same thing. You go, oh my gosh, that's what I want. And that's what you want. So you know what I'm going to do? You pray for me. I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that you get that. And I'm going to pray that we both get that. And then God answers the one prayer but denies the other. Those are frustrating places where you go, I'm going to pray for them. And God says, I'm going to answer that prayer. Yes. And you go, great. So me, not quite yet. Like, what? No. But what I want you to see in this story is how actually Abimelech is the one who's faithful. And Abraham, the great hero of faith, is the one who is unfaithful. In fact, actually, think about the story. Who's talking with God? Abimelech. Who's God talking to? Abimelech. Who's God coming to? Abimelech. Who is restoring the marriage? Abimelech. Who cares more about the marriage, Abraham or Abimelech? Abimelech. And so all of this is that actually Abimelech is the one who proves to be faithful. Abraham, the hero of the faith, proves to be unfaithful. And so what do we do with that? I'll tell you what's really interesting is that God does not switch the story to Abimelech. That God doesn't actually experience this story and go, Abraham, bro, like we've had this conversation before. Everywhere you go, the same thing happens. And finally, I found an Abimelech who actually does what I've asked him to do. You know what? Forget you, Abraham. Abimelech's my boy. Abimelech gets me. We're going to go with Abimelech now. Abimelech, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Abimelech, I'm going to give you lots of land. Abimelech, curse those who curse you, bless those who bless you. But that's not what God does. As we find out, the story is still going to follow Abraham. Why? Because God is the promise maker, the promise keeper. And even when we fail, God's story will still prevail. Do you believe that? That even when you fail, that God's story will still prevail? Even when you fail, at your worst, even when you fail, God's story is still going to prevail. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not consequences. That doesn't mean that there's not issues. Doesn't mean that there's not broken relationships. But what it does mean is that even when you fail, that God's story is still going to prevail. And by the way, that's the story of the gospel. I mean, when you think about even Genesis 1 and 2, and then Genesis 3. Even when humanity fails, God's story still prevails. Even here, when humanity fails, God's story still prevails. When David fails, God's story still prevails. That's the story of the cross. Romans actually tells us all of humanity has failed. That God's story is not dependent upon the faithfulness of humanity. Is that actually, even though all of humanity has and will fail, actually that God's story is still going to prevail. That's the story of Revelation. All of humanity can and will fail, but God's story will prevail. That's the story of redemption. That's why when I talk with people, they go, but Josh, my story, what I've done is I have failed miserably. I go, yeah, I get that. And there's some consequences there. But know this, that even when you fail, that God's story will still prevail. And that speaks to his power, to his goodness. It's interesting because right now we are really afraid that things are going to fail. That maybe our world will fail, our country will fail, our economic system will fail, our political system will fail, that we will fail, that our state will fail, that our city will fail, that maybe in your business or your company or your job that you will fail. All of this fear of failure as if God's salvation story, it hangs in the balance upon our success or failure. It does not. The story tells us. Because even as we'll see in Genesis chapter 21, when Isaac is conceived on the canvas of this brokenness, is that even though we fail, that God's story will still prevail. May you walk this morning out of here with that sort of confidence. Even if you fail. No, let me change that. When you fail. When you fail. Even if and when our politicians fail. Even if and when our country were to fail. Even if and when your finances were to fail, your relationships were to fail. Here's the beautiful thing about redemption. Even when you fail and we fail, that God's story still prevails, because that's redemption. And we're going to see this to be true. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for who you are. God, we thank you that your success is not dependent upon our faithfulness or our goodness. We thank you that your story and the story that you're telling, the story of redemption, the story of salvation, is not dependent upon our goodness, but your goodness. It's not dependent upon our faithfulness, but your faithfulness. God, even we see here a story where your hero, our somebody that's in the Hall of Fame of faith, fails miserably. Is that we see your story still prevail. God, I pray for the places in our lives where we have failed and are failing. Trapped in sin, we pray that your story of redemption would prevail. That'd be true for us individually. That'd be true for us corporately as a people. We thank you for all that you do. We love you. We pray for these things in your name. Amen. Amen.